So welcome everybody this morning to the next installment of our research bites at the UCD Institute of Food and Health. And this morning, I'm just chairing on behalf of Dolores, who is unable to make it. Breige today is going to talk to us about her work on food consumption surveys. So to introduce Breige, Breige is an assistant professor in nutrition within the School of Ag and Food Science at UCD and is one of the core members of the Institute of Food and Health. She completed her degree and PhD up at Ulster University in Coleraine and has been based then in UCD working with the other teams on the national food consumption surveys in Ireland, and her interests are in the area of food consumption and data, using this data to understand the impact of nutrients and ingredients and also chemicals on health with a view to underpinning food safety and nutrition policy. So Breige today is going to really summarise all of this in her talk on the importance of understanding food consumption in Ireland. So I'll hand over to you, Breige, now, but just remind everybody, we'll do Q&A at the end, but if people have questions as they go along, pop them into the chat and we'll come to those, but we'll also ask people to shout out at the end as well. Okay, thanks, Breige.
Thanks, Iodine. Thanks for inviting me here today to talk a bit about my research. So over the next 15 or 20 minutes, what I hope to do is kind of give an overview of my research and I suppose highlight why it's really important that we understand food consumption here in Ireland and I suppose the uses that we have for it. So I'm going to give everyone a bit of a background, excuse me. First, obviously some of you will know this, but just in case anyone doesn't know, why we collect food consumption, or what are our food consumption surveys? Really what they are is a record of the intake of food and beverages of a particular population group. So what we do is we get participants representative of a population group and we record what they're consuming. And we do that for a certain period of time. And other data that we can collect for that as well is that we can collect not only what they're eating, but also where they eat it, who prepares it, what the meal is called or what eating location it is, if they've made it themselves, what recipe they've used, the cooking method that they've used, and we can do it to very detailed level that we can collect brand details and even packaging information. And therefore what we come out with is very detailed information on a representative population group of what foods that people are consuming. And this is what we do in Ireland. Not every survey that looks at food consumption would do this, but we do it in Ireland. And food consumption data is collected worldwide, so it's collected in America, in the UK, Australia, etc., across Europe, because it's really important that we have it. Also, you can collect other detailed information as part of it, so you can collect health and lifestyle questionnaire data, physical activity levels, anthropometric measures such as height and weight, biofluids such as urine and blood samples, and maybe other health markers such as blood pressure. And for some of the surveys, we would collect all of this information, which leaves us quite large data sets to look at within our population. And in particular in Ireland, when we look at it, we've done it for quite a number of years and in quite a number of population groups by now. So over the nearly 15 years, I've been involved in collecting food consumption data. And for adults, we can see that we've collected it. 2001 was kind of the first major one, the North-South Irish Food Consumption Survey. And we followed this by NANS in 2011, and currently we're back out on the field. So we've got funded again to do NANS 2. And that's currently underway, as I said, a bit more difficult due to COVID, but we're getting there. But we've also collected information in teenagers. So we've looked at this group twice now. We've just finished up, we're just finishing up one of the surveys now. The funding's completed at the end of this year. And then again, we've looked at children twice, and we've looked at our preschool children once, back in 2012. And so why is it really important to do this? So I'm going to show you some of my research and what I've looked at and how that leads into these particular areas. But when it comes to the food consumption surveys, really it's really important for food safety, first and foremost, I would say, because to make sure that the foods that we consume are safe, maybe that's in relation to pesticides, residues, or food additives, and to do risk assessment on them, we need to know what we're actually consuming. So it can feed in that way. It can feed into nutrition policy as well. So to understand where we're at in terms of recommendations. So are we meeting sugar recommendations that we have, fat recommendations that we have? We need to know what we're consuming in order to do that. And also, maybe not as important, but it's still used very much by the food industry as well. So we've a lot of reformulation by food industry happening. And we also, food industry have a lot of new product development, and they can also use this information. And we've done work for, Nestle, for the National Dairy Council, for the Irish Bread Bakers Association in relation to looking at particular food intakes and patterns of food intakes. So it's really important for them. But I suppose my interest particularly, as I mentioned, is really to look at the foods that we consume in Ireland, how we consume them, those dietary patterns, and how that relates to particular public health. Maybe that's in relation to weight status or cardiovascular disease, but also in terms of looking at the nutrients that those particular foods that we eat provide, or the food ingredients such as whole grain or food chemicals, as I said, food additives, or in particular my particular area is sweeteners, and how that feeds into public health. So they're my interests. I suppose over the last 15 years, I've kind of have done work in those particular areas. And in terms of nutrition and policy, when we look at these food consumption surveys, obviously we can look at what people are consuming in Ireland and what that provides in terms of intakes and status. And we do a lot of that, and then we report it, and we produce those reports and put them up online. So if you're ever interested, if you go to www.iuna.net, you'll find all of those reports for those different population groups that we've researched. I have a particular interest in weight status as well. So I've measured, as part of the surveys, we measure weight, as I said. So we're able to look at, I suppose, the prevalence of overweight and obesity, and if it's changed over time, because obviously we do these surveys or we have done over a couple of years now. And we are able to look not only at the prevalence, but delve a bit deeper into understanding, well, what's the determinants of that? Do we see differences in different groups? And we do. When we look, for example, at social class, we can see that there's a higher prevalence of weight status, in a sense, those being classified as overweight and obese in those who are of a lower social class. And all of this will feed into policy. So we have our Irish Obesity Action Plan, and the data that we've produced as part of the service is fed in there. It's also fed into, for example, food fortification, when we've looked at folic acid in terms of neural tube defects and how much we're intaking and the status we're at. And also in terms of food-based dietary guidelines. So the food-based dietary guidelines are produced by the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. And we have done work that's helped them produce these dietary guidelines. And one of those projects that we were involved in was NutriData. So as part of NutriData, one of the kind of tasks were to look at the dietary strategies in terms of our older adults and our preschool children. And the reason we did this was because we hadn't really looked at these particular groups within Ireland. And we wanted to know what are the particular areas of concerns within these groups, if those who had poor versus better intakes, what was the difference between them? And with that, we could suggest strategies to potentially make improvements, and potential strategies could be in promoting better food choices, reformulation, fortification, supplementation. So as part of that NutriData project, we did that. And I'm glad to see that that data then was used as well as the food surveys. And the Food Safety Authority of Ireland recently came out with their policies, or their food-based dietary guidelines for older adults this year in 2021, and for their preschool children back in 2020. And the preschool survey and NAMS was really heavily used in creating that evidence-based the scientific evidence to create these dietary guidelines. Other areas, for example, that I have done research in previously using the surveys is looking at micronutrients, and one particular is iodine that I've looked at. So this hit the news a few years ago because evidence or research came from the UK to suggest, firstly, that potentially the status in the UK was not optimal. So they were seeing that certain groups of their population didn't have adequate intakes or status. And also there was research then surrounding the lack of iodine during pregnancy and how that can potentially link to a lower IQ in babies. So there was strong evidence to suggest that there was a link. So again, this led to, I suppose, the Irish population, and in particular, it came up with parliamentary questions. What steps are we taking to address the Irish population's iodine deficiency? Because we don't have fortified salt. So a lot of European countries, and actually globally, they use table salt and they fortify it with iodine to make sure that there's enough iodine in the food system to make an adequate status in the population. We don't have that. So the question was asked, but we didn't know whether we were deficient. The data didn't exist at that point. So we undertook research using the consumption survey NANS. We linked it with data from the Food Safety Authority of Ireland because they had analysed iodine concentrations in the Irish food. And we also linked it with urinary iodine concentrations because we had biofluids linked to the food's consumption surveys. We were able to do this. And this was a lovely piece of work because we were able to show from that, so this is the publication, that our population status of iodine was adequate. So the WHO would suggest that 100 micrograms per litre and above, so if a median value of the population is at that, then the classification of the population is adequate. What was interesting from this work as well, and I think it shows quite nicely how we're linked with our food systems, because 45% of our iodine actually in the Irish adult population was coming from milk sources, which is quite a high amount. We don't see another nutrient like that we would see quite one unique source of food providing so much of one nutrient. And that, of course, is because the cows are supplemented with minerals that they take, and that obviously directly enhances their milk supply, which directly enhances the amount of iodine that we're getting. And what we're able to do as well, because we had the biofluids, so this shows what from the analysis that we undertook. So this graph here, the first one shows when we split by dairy consumption, though this is milk consumption. So these are non-consumers of milk versus high consumers of milk in the adult population. And the light grey is dietary iodine intakes, and the dark black is the urinary iodine concentrations of those particular individuals in these 4 different groups. And you can see that there is a really strong linkage. So those people who are non-consumers of milk had significantly lower intakes, but also significantly lower iodine status. So you can see that direct influence that milk consumption was having. And also you can see it here very nicely because we have the seasonal divide, a bit like vitamin D, but the opposite in a sense. What happens when the cows, as you might know, go in over the winter, the feed is fortified, or they're given fortification and supplementation at that point. And that again has a direct influence, and they have higher quantities of iodine in their milk over the winter months. And what we were able to show here was when we split it by season, so you can see the dark again is the urinary iodine, and the light grey is the dietary intakes, that we were able to show that those winter months, so coming into your now October, December, our iodine status actually increases because of that direct increase in the milk status. So it's really interesting that one thing that happens at the farm level per se has a direct influence on our population status. But further on from this work, I suppose one thing that we did come out with it is to say that there are at-risk groups. We looked at it in the overall population, but it's really important that we look at it in children and in pregnant women in particular. So what I hope to do now, and one of my PhD students, Emma, is looking at it, is to look at children and adolescents, because we have their data their intake data, and we have urinary samples from them. So it's really important that we now are able to measure that iodine concentration in those samples to see if we have any issues, because of course dietary patterns change. We only do a snapshot in time with these surveys, hence we have to update them all the time. And what we do know from our newer surveys in our children and adolescents is actually milk consumption has dropped. And again, that change in dietary patterns, it could be from, I suppose, a sustainability perspective, but it could potentially have a knock-on effect on our particular status of iodine. So it's really important that we look at this area. Another piece of work that I've been involved in is to look at fat reformulation as well. So what we're able to do with the surveys as well is use them for modelling. And this was work that I did with colleagues here in the Institute. So Professor Frank Monaghan and Professor Helen Roach, with our PhD student Yvonne Lenihan leading this particular piece of work, and with our colleagues as well in Chagas. So they did a particular intervention in where they had these animals, cows, that they fed 3 different types of feed. So they had a grass-fed, a grass concentrated fed, and a concentrated fed only. And what they wanted to look at is then the fatty acid composition of that beef once after they were slaughtered. And then what we wanted to do with that data is to use it to update the beef codes that we have in the food composition data that links to our food consumption, and to see if we change it, what effects that change would have, and whether we would have an impact on our dietary intakes, and whether that would have a knock-on effect on the recommendations. And we were able to do that really nicely. So this is one of the papers from Yvonne's work. And what we did was we incorporated that data, and then we looked at the recommendations when it came to the fats. And if we look at this particular graph here, this is adherence. This is the percentages of the population that adhere to the recommendations. And these are for the different fatty acids. And I'll just focus in on one particular, and that's the saturated fatty acids that we all hear about. And the recommendation is that we should be adhering to less than 10% of our total energy should be coming from saturated fat. And what we can see very nicely here is when we modeled the change, so when we took the fatty acid data and incorporated it into the food consumption data, we can see that there are more people would adhere to the recommendation of having lower levels of saturated fat or energy coming from saturated fat. And they would have higher amounts of PUFA, so I suppose the fats that we want in our diets, so we want that ratio changed. So this work quite nicely showed and how we can use this data that we have on consumption to model that change and show the impact of changing the feed of an animal can again have a knock-on effect on our population intakes, and this from a point of view of fat and fat reformulation. The other work that I suppose of my research interest is away from nutrition per se, but into food safety. And that's, I suppose, really important. This is first and foremost for the food consumption surveys, is to look at food safety. And I have a particular interest in sweetener intakes. So what we're able to do with the data that we have is to link it to the concentration data of particular chemicals. And the area, as I said, sweeteners is an interest of me. So we're able to link the two together, and we've done this. And this is work by Dr. Maria Buffini, who's a postdoc with me in the team, and with colleagues from the Scientific Institute of Public Health in Belgium. What we wanted to do is look at the actual, if there was a risk of particular sweetener intakes in the adult data. And we chose these particular sweeteners here: acetylsulfate K, aspartame, cyclamate, saccharin, sucralose, and steviol glycosides. And we did it 3 tiers. So 3 tiers is this is usual risk assessment that you'll do it. Worst case scenario is the tier 1. So that's all products that can have a sweetener can have it at the maximum amount, which is very unrealistic. And then tier 3 would be more realistic. So you look at the products that are being consumed and you measure the actual amount of sweeteners. So this is what the Belgium Scientific Institute did for us. They measured the concentration. We sent the products over to them, and they were able to send us the data back. And then we did the tier 3 model to show if there was a risk. And you can see there, these are the acceptable daily intakes. So this is the amount of sweeteners that we can actually consume on a daily basis over the lifetime, and we will not be at risk. So these are set by the European Union under the regulation. And if we look particularly at the consumers only here, this is, I suppose, the worst case. So these are the 99% consumers. So they're the real high consumers of these particular sweeteners. And they, at this level of intake, this is the percentage ADI that they met. So as you can see, none of them, if you went to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and it will lower obviously as we go to a more refined tier 3, we can see that none of them actually met the percentage ADI or met that ADI. So we didn't see that we were at risk in the adult population. So this is really important to do to make sure that there is no risk and the food that we're consuming is safe from this point of view. Going on further and using that data, what we've done here is we've incorporated with data looking at ultra-processed foods. So ultra-processed foods is hitting the headlines quite a bit, especially in nutrition research, in terms of researchers have suggested that we should be looking at foods that are highly processed or ultra-processed. And potentially they have a negative impact on health. I think the jury's still out on whether this is the best way to look at it, and because it's taken its focus away from nutrition. But what we did here was to use the sweetener concentration data that we have, because we've really fine data on that, and to look at those, to put people into quartiles of ultra-processed food consumption. And we can see that quartile, if we look at this graph here, quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are the highest consumers of ultra-processed food. They all have consumed ultra-processed food, but quartile 4 is the highest. And when we did this and we looked at those particular sweeteners again, what we did see is that only for acetyl sulfate, K, aspartame, and saccharin, there seemed to be a difference, but only in those high consumers. So even though all of these quartiles consume some level of ultra-processed foods, we don't see a significant difference until we get to the very, very high consumers. Again, but to remind everyone that overall there is no risk, because when we do the risk assessment, all intakes are below the ADI. So it would be nice to take this research further. And what we're hoping to do as well is, there's a lot of controversy in the research in relation to sweeteners and the effect sweeteners can have on metabolic health. And of course, it's becoming more interesting because of the reformulation the sugar tax has brought in. And potentially we are going to see an increase in the amount of sweeteners that we're going to consume. So what we'd like to do is to look at the metabolic health impacts of this. And with the newer data on adolescents, because potentially they have a higher intake, is to look at the effect that sweetener intake potentially has on metabolic health, so in terms of insulin and glucose. And that's something that we hope to do with this type of research. Another, I suppose, new piece of research that we're doing, and just to highlight again the importance of having this data, is for the Food Safety Authority of Ireland. So this is based on UK wheat flour and the Brexit implications. So some of you may know that the majority of our flour that comes into the Republic of Ireland comes from the UK. We don't have any flour mills within the UK or within Ireland. So the amounts, the 220,000 tons of flour come in to produce the products that come onto the market using flour. And that, for example, is your breads, your pastries, your biscuits, your breadcrumbs in meats, in processed meats, etc. So there's a huge amount that come in from the UK. Unfortunately, before the UK left the European Union, they actually had a derogation where their wheat flour was fortified, and it was fortified with calcium, iron, thiamine, and lysine. But now, since the UK has left, and under the regulation, wheat flour potentially is no longer going to be fortified when it comes into Ireland, because there is no derogation for us in particular. So this may have a huge implication again on our nutrient intake, on our adequacy for those particular those particular nutrients. And when we look at it, we know, for example, for calcium and iron, about 20% of that comes from our bread sources, believe it or not. So it's obviously having a huge impact, this fortification. So what we're hoping to do, or what FSAI would want us to do for them is to look at this, to model the impact. If we remove that fortification, what would that mean in terms of the adequacy of the Irish population? So that's what we hope to do, and also hope to do some work in terms of modelling the impact if there was fortification and at a certain level, what impact that would have. And obviously that's really useful data for FSAI to have, to maybe go back to the European Union and, you know, suggest that there is implications for us as a nation in terms of the adequacy of these nutrients and that we need to do something about it. So it's really interesting work that we're going to undertake for them in this area. And lastly, I suppose the last bit of research I want to highlight, and I suppose the more recent area that we've started to look into, myself and PhD student Laura Kerwin, is to look at sustainable consumption. So sustainability is very all over the place at the minute, as it should be, in terms of how do we look at sustainability in terms of the foods that we eat, and that's obviously looking across the food system. But when it comes to the data that we hold on the consumption, it's really useful data that we can use to potentially model the effect of the current consumption patterns that we have, and potentially then look at, again, modeling the changes that we would need or could introduce to help to increase that sustainable dietary patterns. And in order to do that, we need to look at food consumption data for all the population groups, because when we look at this, we need to look, of course, at environmental impacts. So what, from the foods that we're consuming, what is the impact on greenhouse gases, water usage, etc. But also nutritional adequacy. So in terms of how nutritionally adequate that diet is, the cost of that diet in terms of the economical component, and also the social and cultural acceptability. And when we have this data, then we can look at it in terms of the population groups and a model impact. If we were to make changes, what impact that would have. So if we were to try and reduce that environmental impact by reducing foods, how would that affect nutritional adequacy, or can we prevent it from affecting nutritional adequacy? So that's work that Laura is currently ongoing with. She's due to submit her thesis early next year. So hopefully we will be able to get that work published early next year to show something in this area as well. So I think that's just a snapshot, an overview of everything. Just to acknowledge all the collaborators that I have on all the different institutions, and also the obviously funders, and the main funder, Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, who fund these surveys and continue to do so. And I'd like to leave it there and open the floor to any questions.